Sparta, often the subject of great mystification and fantastical legend. Their armies were so fierce, trained from birth, and their tactics so genius they could bring empires to their knees. On the other side of the coin, Athens, seafaring powerhouse of commerce and intellectual center of the Greek world. When these two great city-states would inevitably come into conflict, it would be the fate of the entire Greek world that would be decided. Today we ask, what if things had gone differently? What if instead of Sparta, Athens won the great Peloponnesian War? Ancient Greece by 431 BC was flourishing. Having just beaten back the Persians for the second time, the Greeks saw their wealth and power grow greatly, especially two particular city-states that would come to compete for dominance in the region, Sparta and Athens. The two former allies against the Persians now sat firmly at one another's throats. Athens, with its mighty navy, had begun assembling the coastal and island city-states into an alliance known as the Delian League. These cities were becoming more and more akin to vassals of Athens, as it dominated their trade and controlled their foreign policy with threat of the massive Athenian navy. Sparta, on the other hand, had a land army unmatched in the region, with an ingrained warrior culture which began training its men for combat at birth. With this leverage, they formed their own alliance, the Peloponnesian League, and so the scene was set, two city-states vying for dominance of the Greek world. By 431, the two sides were in direct conflict, each dominating their respective fields. Athens was unmatched at sea, while the Spartans occupied the land outside of Athens, laying a decades-long siege of the city. However, not only a year into the conflict, Athens was hit with a great plague that killed up to 25% of its population, including its lead general Pericles. But even after this great calamity, the Athenians remained a serious force, seizing parts of the Peloponnesian peninsula. However, the Spartans were able to turn onto the offensive, defeating the Athenian forces and capturing Amphipolis. Soon the Spartan navy was able to build up to match the Athenians, cementing their fate. Athens would surrender in 404 BC. Sparta would find itself as the top dog of Greece. However, with the war having dragged on so long, their population was a fraction of what it had been. Sparta's power waned until they were surpassed by Thebes as the dominant force in Greece. By the time the Macedonian Empire took Greece, neither were in a strong enough place to resist, and Sparta was so irrelevant that Alexander never bothered to conquer it. So what changes in a world where Athens was instead the victor of the Peloponnesian War? As it turns out, a lot. But first, let's make it happen. It's no secret that the plague played a major role in losing Athens the war. Losing a fourth of your population and your most esteemed general makes winning such a thing difficult. So we can start with the removal of the plague that hit Athens in 430 BC, and in fact moving it to Sparta. Sanitary standards there were virtually the same as in Athens anyway. It's no worse than it was in our timeline, taking out about 25% of the Spartan population. This allows Athens to remain on the offensive, and takes away Sparta's ability to retake the initiative. Just as in our timeline, Athens defeats the Spartans at the Battle of Pylos in 425 BC, forcing the surrender of 300 Spartans. At this point, Sparta would be unable to seize the initiative, meaning no offensive into Amphipolis. As Sparta attempts to rebuild itself from the plague, Athens would build their own land army up to match the Spartans. By 420 BC, Pericles leads a naval invasion to break the siege of Athens and the occupation of Attica. His army then goes on to defeat the garrison around Sparta itself and lays siege to the city. Knowing the Spartans, I doubt they would simply surrender to their Athenian rivals, preferring instead to endure a long siege until eventually Athens would prevail. The Peloponnesian League would be absorbed into the Delian League, Athens securing its hold over Greece. So what does Athens winning the war over Sparta change? A lot. Athens and Sparta were completely different. Sparta's strength came almost entirely from its military, and when it couldn't sustain it, its grip over Greece near immediately collapsed. Athens, on the other hand, was growing into a commercial powerhouse. The Delian League was being rapidly consolidated into an Athenian-led confederation. This process would continue and apply to almost all of Greece. The Greeks would for the first time form into a more unified force led by Athens, and notably not the Macedonians. With Greece as divided as it was in our timeline, there was nearly no real resistance to Alexander the Great and his father's conquest/unification of the region. Now, there is a chance that through sheer military might, genius, and innovation, the Macedonians could have still rolled over the rest of Greece. However, then this timeline would be near indistinguishable from our own. And with Greece much more centralized, I think it's more than possible Athens could muster the might to defeat the Macedonians. This changes the fate of the entire Near East. The Achaemenid Persians are never conquered and replaced by the Greek hordes. The Persians at this point had been waning in strength for a few decades, marred by instability as their succession process had been reduced to a series of coups d'etats. Egypt had fallen out and back into Persian control. I find it likely that Egypt would eventually regain its independence, establishing a 31st dynasty. The Middle East and Persia would remain under Achaemenid control, never divulging into Greek kingdoms. Back to the Mediterranean. The Athenians would lead a much more centralized and concerted effort to colonize the south of Italy. I could see the Greeks colonizing most of the south of the peninsula. And now things grow even more interesting, as the Greeks come into close contact with two major powers of the Mediterranean: Rome, who had consolidated much of Italy, and Carthage, a fellow seafaring merchant empire. If you know anything about Carthage, it's probably from their role as Rome's opponent during the Punic Wars. By their end, the Romans firmly defeated the Carthaginians and asserted themselves as the only major power of the Mediterranean. With the Delian Greek force now in the region, the balance of power is vastly changed. Rome's largest advantage was its relative isolation from Carthage, who lacked a foothold on the Italian peninsula. With the Greeks already owning such a foothold, if the Carthaginians and Greeks were to ally against the Romans, they might just be able to rewrite this outcome. From here I see two possibilities. In the first, the Greek and Carthaginians either fail to ally and both individually fall to Rome, or they do and are defeated all the same, perhaps by a swift conquest from the Romans of southern Italy. In this scenario, Rome is eventually able to conquer both Carthage and Greece. Roman expansion would take a very similar path to that of our own timeline, with the exception of in the east. It would be interesting to see the Romans face off against the Achaemenid Persians, or in this alternative timeline's Egyptian dynasty. In the second outcome, the Greeks and Carthaginians ally against the Romans and effectively defend southern Italy, eventually seizing and defeating Rome, forcing the Romans to remain in the northern Italian peninsula, pay hefty reparations, and demilitarize, similar to what the Romans demanded of the Carthaginians of our own timeline. This effectively removes the Roman Empire as the European unifying, Mediterranean-spanning empire it became in our world. This changes everything. Gaul, or modern-day France, the Northern Balkans, Northern Iberia, Britannia, Ireland, or Hibernia as the Romans called it, all remain Celtic tribal lands. I recommend watching Alternative History Hub's 3-part video on such a topic, as it goes far more into depth than I ever could. But in short, the Celtic tribes would never be conquered, genocided, and forced to adopt Mediterranean customs, such customs which would lay the groundwork for what we consider European culture. Instead, the Celtic people are more softly influenced by the Carthaginians, Romans, and Greeks through trade. Speaking of trade, as the Greeks and Carthaginians' power grew, they would begin to vie against one another for economic dominance of the Mediterranean. I could see this eventually boiling over into a Punic-Greek war, the winner of which would enjoy an increasing monopoly over the trade in the sea, and would take a predominant role in influencing the northern tribes. The cities of Greece, especially Athens, would be the grandest in all of Europe, and maybe the world. Hubs of philosophy and commerce. Who could say how far the Athenians, with a booming merchant class and emphasis on knowledge, would advance? Perhaps we could have seen the emergence of modern steam-powered engines thousands of years before our own timeline. Primitive versions of such things were invented in Egypt between 30 and 15 BC in our own world, after all. Southern Italy and perhaps eastern Anatolia would be completely Grekified. The last topic I want to touch on is that of religion. Hellenistic religion would obviously dominate the Greek world and Rome. Carthaginian paganism would maintain its hold in the Carthaginian Empire. The ancient Egyptian pantheon could continue to evolve and thrive in Egypt, and Zoroastrianism would remain predominant within the Persian Empire. This world leaves many questions to be asked. Would the Greeks slowly spread out into Anatolia and the Balkans? Would the Persians be able to maintain themselves and avoid collapse? If Jesus was still born, how would the Persian Empire deal with a Christian movement? Would Christianity spread or remain a local religion? A completely different world, all because of a different outcome of a relatively minor conflict between two cities.